Welcome to Season of Stuck, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the all-too-human experience of feeling stuck. I'm your host, Deanna deBara, and on this podcast, we explore all things stuck. How and why stuckness happens, what it feels like, how to learn and grow from it, and ultimately, how to get unstuck and move forward in an authentic, empowered way. If you are looking for insights, support, and community as you make your journey from stuck to unstuck, you're in the right place. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Season of Stuck. I am your host, Deanna. If this is your first time listening, welcome to the podcast. And if this is not your first time listening, welcome back. I have historically experienced stuckness as a very isolating and lonely thing. So I am so grateful for the fact that we get to explore what it means to be stuck and how to get unstuck together. So thank you for being here. So as I mentioned last week, we are going to be experimenting with some new episode formats here at Season of Stuck, including solo episodes. And today is the first of those episodes. For today's episode, it's just you and me, and we are going to be exploring my most recent season of stuck. And more importantly, the tools and strategies that I use to shake off the stuckness, break through the inertia, and get myself here to where I am today, which I can honestly say is one of the most unstuck periods I've ever experienced. So first, we're going to talk about how and why I was stuck. Then I'm going to give you 3 tools that I use to get myself through this period of stuckness and share a little bit about why those tools are effective. And then towards the end of the episode, we're going to recap each tool and I'll share some key takeaways so that you can walk away from this podcast with a clear, actionable strategy on how to apply these tools to your own stuck journey. So to kick things off, let's take a look back at my most recent experience with major stuckness. My most recent season of stuck started last year in 2023, and it started at work. I have been a writer for almost a decade, and while I've written all sorts of things in that time, the majority of my work, especially in recent years, has been focused on content marketing, which is basically writing for businesses. And I was really fortunate to find a lot of success in the content marketing space. The demand for content went through the roof in 2020, when pretty much every business on the planet was forced to shift to a digital strategy. I had more work than I knew what to do with, and it stayed that way for years. On paper, I was extremely successful. I was working with really amazing and well-known clients, I was doing well financially, and my business seemed to grow more and more each passing month. And I took a lot of pride in that success. As a college dropout that had a really roundabout career path and took a long time to find their way, it felt good to build a business that aligned with our cultural definition of success. And while I wasn't consciously trying to, I ended up tying a lot of my self-worth and identity to that business and the success that came with it. But while things looked good on paper, in reality, I was struggling. Like I said, I had more work than I knew what to do with. But I kept on taking more work anyway. It was consuming. I was exhausted, burned out, and having a really hard time managing everything. I didn't have any time to pursue anything outside of work, and it felt like my entire life revolved around my business to-do list and the work I was doing for clients. It felt like I was treading water. I was putting in so much effort to stay afloat and get everything done, but it felt like even if I stopped for a second, I would drown in the overwhelm. And those ongoing feelings of exhaustion and burnout and overwhelm slowly but surely had a huge impact on how I felt about my business. I hit a point where I recognized that I just wasn't passionate about what I was doing anymore, at least not in the way that I was doing it. But again, so much of my self-worth and identity was tied up in this business that even though I knew in my heart that things needed to change, I felt stuck on the path that I was on. It felt crazy to take a step back from a business that was doing so well. But then taking that step back was no longer a choice. In 2023, my industry dramatically changed. Maybe it was the economy, maybe it was the rise in generative AI like ChatGPT, but whatever it was, there just wasn't the same volume of work that I was accustomed to. Companies just weren't investing in content like they used to. And a huge number of editors and content managers that I worked with fell victim to layoffs. And as a result, I lost clients that I had been working with for years. In other words, my business as I had known it completely changed over the course of a few months. Now, considering how stuck I had felt prior to this change, you might think that this shift in my business would feel liberating and help me get unstuck. But that thought would not be entirely accurate, or even a little bit accurate. The truth is, having my business change so dramatically ushered in one of my longest and most challenging seasons of stuck yet. Because I tied so much of my self-worth and identity into my business, when that business changed, so did the way that I viewed and related to myself. Because my business wasn't feeling like the success that it once was, I felt like I wasn't the success that I once was. I felt stuck in feelings of shame and inadequacy. And because I was already coming off of a period of intense burnout and overwhelm, I was just not in the place to navigate this change or the feelings that went along with it in a healthier, productive way. These feelings of shame and inadequacy and really denial kept me absolutely paralyzed. I felt like I had lost this core part of my identity and who I was. I had no idea what I was going to do or what I wanted to do or what the path forward was going to look like. And that uncertainty felt overwhelming. My body was in total freeze mode. I spent a lot of time kind of zoning out, scrolling on social media or watching YouTube videos or thinking about all the things that I could be doing or should be doing, but I wasn't. All of which made me feel even worse about myself because I wasn't doing anything that felt productive or creative or worthwhile in any way. I felt depressed and unmotivated and just overall bad. And I felt that way for months and months and months. It was a really dark time for me. I really struggled with knowing who I was or what I had to offer. But at a certain point, I got really sick of feeling stuck. I recognized that I had to do something to shake myself out of this state and find a way forward that made me feel excited and hopeful about the future. And it was at that point where I started my journey from stuck to unstuck. And what a journey it was. I did more research during this time than I think I have ever done at any point in my life, including when I was in college. I was so determined to find a way out of the stuckness. And as a result, I learned so much along the way. There were so many things that I learned and practices that supported me as I navigated my stuckness and got myself into a better, more unstuck place. And so I am going to share a few of those things with you today. And hopefully they're just as helpful and supportive to you as they were to me. Now, I'm going to list these tips in the order in which I use them to get unstuck. And I'm doing that for a reason. Because my body was in such a state of freeze, I knew that in order to start getting unstuck, I was going to have to change my body state. I was going to have to shock my system to get out of this state of inertia and re-energize myself. And the way that I chose to do that is through cold plunging. In case you're not familiar, cold plunging or cold water immersion is exactly what the name implies. It is immersing yourself in very, very, very cold water and then staying there for an extended period of time, generally anywhere between 3 and 10 minutes. Now, let me just say off the bat that there is not a ton of research out there about cold plunging, and many of the benefits that I experienced are only backed up by anecdotal evidence. And also, while I loved cold plunging, I want to highlight that it is not for everyone. So I'm just going to share my experience and the kind of general school of thought on why I had the experience I did. So when it comes to stuckness, the biggest benefit I experienced from cold plunging is how it made me feel. Now, not initially. When you initially get into the water, it is intense, to put it mildly. Where I plunged, the water was just slightly above freezing. Like there were literal blocks of ice in the water. And water that cold, it is a shock to the system. And that shock is thought to activate your body's sympathetic nervous system or fight or flight mode. There's cortisol, there's adrenaline, and at least in my experience, everything in my brain and my body was screaming at me to get out, which makes sense because if you were out in the wild and fell into a freezing body of water, you would need to get out to survive. So my body and brain were doing the correct thing. But I wasn't in the wild. I was at a wellness center and I was safe. And so I decided to ride that feeling out. And a few minutes in, there was a definite shift. I settled into the experience and felt a sense of calm and centeredness and almost euphoria, which, according to cold plunge enthusiasts, was my body's parasympathetic nervous system activating, releasing a cascade of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine that help to regulate mood and increase energy and focus. And that is where the magic happened for me. On the days I cold plunged, I felt like a literal superhero. I felt excited and sharp and happy and motivated and focused, not only when I was in the plunge and immediately after, but for the majority of the day. Cold plunging allowed me to reclaim all of those feelings and bodily sensations that had been missing from my life and experience during this season of stuck. That shock to my system literally shook me out of my stuck state and put me in a better place to figure out how to move forward in my life and continue getting unstuck. It was also really empowering. Like I mentioned, when I first got into the water, my brain immediately told me to get out. But I didn't. I sat through the experience even though it was hard and uncomfortable, and I found serious benefits on the other side. And that taught me a few things. It taught me that A, I didn't have to listen to what my brain was telling me, which for a self-critical overthinker was pretty revolutionary. B, that not only was I capable of sitting through challenge and discomfort, but doing so could deliver real rewards. And C, that I was a person that was willing to challenge myself and make myself uncomfortable in the pursuit of joy and growth and getting unstuck. All of which felt really good. Not only did cold plunging give me the energy and motivation and mood boost that I needed to start the journey from stuck to unstuck, but it became a kind of metaphor for getting through my own stuckness. I cold plunge about 3 to 4 times a week for about 8 months straight. And I eventually got to the point where I could be in the water for 12 minutes at a time. And while I took a bit of a break, I've recently gotten back into it. And it feels so good to be back doing something that makes me feel so unstuck. So, cold plunging helped to shift my body and brain. It took me out of the physical inertia I was feeling and helped to put me in a better place to navigate the stuckness I was experiencing in my life. And once I was in that better place, I was ready to tackle the more internal part of my stuckness, starting with reclaiming myself. As I mentioned before, I got to a place where my sense of self-worth, self-identity was very tied up in my business and how successful my business was. My internal dialogue was extremely self-critical and judgmental. I felt like my brain was in a constant loop of telling me what a failure I was and how I wasn't as worthy now that my business wasn't doing as well, and that I had nothing else to offer or nothing else that made me special or worthwhile or successful. And I knew that a big part of getting unstuck was untangling those ties, challenging that nasty internal dialogue, and reclaiming a sense of self that was completely detached from my business or job or whatever I chose to do for a living. In other words, I needed to rewrite the stories that I was telling myself. And the way that I did that was I literally rewrote the stories in the form of letters to myself. When I would catch myself lost in self-critical thoughts, I would pull out my journal and start writing a letter to myself from myself. But like the kindest, most compassionate version of myself I could ever hope to be. I was basically trying to talk to myself in the way that I would talk to my closest friend, and challenging all of the mean things that were running through my head at any given moment. For example, when I would get stuck in thought loops of being a failure, I would write a letter reassuring myself that I wasn't a failure and then list all of the successes I could think of. If I found myself thinking that my business was the best or most interesting thing about me, I would make a list of all of the cool and interesting and quirky things about me, things that have nothing to do with the business that make me me. If I got stuck in anxious thoughts about how my business was over and what was I going to do, I would write myself a little reassuring message, reminding myself that while my business was not as busy as it once was, it was still doing fine. And that even though things were slow at the moment, they wouldn't always be that way. And if they did stay that way, that I could just do something else and it would all be totally okay. Sometimes my letters would go on for pages in my journal, and sometimes they would just be a quick note of encouragement scribbled on a post it note. But they were consistent. And the more consistently I wrote these letters, challenging all of the beliefs that were making me feel stuck, the more my beliefs started changing. And ultimately, the more unstuck I felt. Basically, my stories about my worth being tied to my business were keeping me stuck. And the practice of writing letters to myself, challenging those stories, changed me. It did not happen overnight. And even today, I can find myself slipping into those old thought patterns. But over time, those letters that I wrote to myself helped me shape a new narrative. The more I wrote, the more I started to believe what I was writing, that my sense of worthiness had nothing to do with my business or really anything that I do or don't do in my career. That I had so much to offer the world, obviously, outside of like content marketing services. That I could find purpose and meaning and a sense of accomplishment in my life, and that could be completely separate from this business that I had built. Writing these letters helped me change the way that I felt about myself. They helped me not feel stuck in a constant barrage of negative and judgmental and self critical thoughts. And getting unstuck from those thoughts created space. Space in my brain, space in my schedule, and space in my life in general. And what I did with that space is the last tool, at least the last tool that I'm going to talk about today, that I used to get unstuck. So at this point, I had been stuck in the same place for months. And in that time, I had been doing or not doing the same things over and over and over again. And as the saying goes, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. I realized that if I wanted a different experience, I was going to need to do different things. And it was in doing those different things that I was fully able to get myself unstuck. I tried a ton of new things as I made my journey from stuck to unstuck, but there are a few specifically that stand out for giving me the momentum that I needed to fully unstuck myself. First, I started dancing. Then, I started dreaming. And finally, I started podcasting. So, dance. I started going to a local dance studio, both for dance fitness classes and for choreography based classes like hip hop and jazz. I did an entire episode on my experience learning dance as an adult and the power of movement for getting unstuck, which, if you're interested in hearing, you can go back to episode 3. But basically, dance got me out of my head and into my body, which was huge in disconnecting from some of the more challenging internal patterns that were keeping me stuck. Dancing also got me out of the house and exercising multiple times a week, which gave me a killer endorphin rush that ultimately helped me feel more motivated. And dance also taught me a really important life lesson, which is that it is totally fine to do something simply for the joy of it. I am not a good dancer by any stretch of the imagination, but that's not what dance is about for me. I dance because it makes me feel good and joyful and alive, not because I need other people to perceive my dancing in any certain way. And as someone who has historically been really concerned about what other people think of me and being seen as competent and successful, that has been a really helpful lesson. And it has opened me up to trying other things that I may not be good at, but are ultimately good for me, which has further contributed to my feeling unstuck. And finally, Dance gave me a sense of community. I absolutely love the people that I dance with. And that sense of community has zero to do with my business or how quote unquote successful I am. Some of the people that I dance with don't even know what I do for a living. The bond is completely around who we are and how we show up and this connection through movement. And that feels great. Dance was and is a huge win, and it continues to help me literally move myself out of any stuckness I experience. Okay, now onto the dreaming part. Now, in the past, I've always been a very big picture person. I'm also very action oriented. So I've been pretty good about taking those big picture goals and creating strategies for how to achieve them. But when I was in the deepest, darkest part of my stuckness, I could not see any possibilities. I was struggling to let go of how things were. And in that struggle, I wasn't allowing myself to dream about how things could be. But once I was in a better place, physically and mentally, I was able to look at this change in my business as an opportunity. What did I want to do? What did I want this next chapter of my career and really of my life to look like? And how could I get there? In this dreaming phase that I was in, I realized that I wanted to build a life that felt truly purposeful. I wanted to do something that actually helped other people. I wanted to feel more connection in my work and create more time and space for creativity and put my writing skills to use in a new and different way. I wanted to keep my writing business going, but I also recognized that it was time to build something else. And all of that dreaming led to the last new thing that helped me get unstuck. And you are listening to it right now. This podcast has been the ultimate tool for getting unstuck. Not only do I get to spend a huge amount of time doing research and reading books on stuck related topics and talking to incredible experts to get their insights into all things stuck, which for sure has helped me with my own stuckness, but I also get to share all of that with you and hopefully help you navigate your own feelings of stuck. And that has infused my career and life with the sense of purpose and meaning that I dreamed about when I was navigating my most recent season of stuck. Creating this podcast has also helped me tap into my creativity, use my writing skills in a new and different way, and disconnect from my business as the be all end all of my career. And it's fun. I genuinely enjoy it and find it so, so interesting. Making this podcast has gotten me out of my comfort zone and for sure out of the stuck zone in the best possible way. And the more I work on it, the more unstuck I feel. And my hope and my goal is for you to feel the same. And finally, creating this podcast has shown me that I am not alone in my stuckness. As I've mentioned many, many times on this podcast, in the past, stuckness has been a really lonely and isolating experience. But talking about it has opened my eyes to the fact that stuckness is not a personal failure, that it's something that we all go through. And this podcast and the response that I've gotten from it have really reinforced that knowledge and shown me that I'm not alone in this. And hopefully it's the same for you. So, those are the tools that I've used on my most recent journey from stuck to unstuck. Now, let's recap and talk about how you can apply these tools to manage your own stuckness. Okay, so the first strategy that I used to go from stuck to unstuck was cold plunging. And while I absolutely love a cold plunge, I completely get that immersing yourself in ridiculously cold water is not everyone's jam and can sound completely overwhelming, especially to start. So, if you want to experiment with cold exposure without fully taking the plunge, pun intended, the good news is you can, and you don't even have to leave your house to do it. Next time you're feeling unmotivated or stuck in a blech kind of mood, try filling up a large bowl with ice water and then dunk your face into the water for a few seconds. If it feels good, dunk it in a few more times. The intensity of the cold can help you shake off that feeling of stuckness and give you a burst of energy to move forward in your day. Now, the second strategy that I use to get unstuck is writing letters from myself to myself, challenging the internal stories that were keeping me stuck. I found this practice not only helpful, but healing. And the great thing about this tool is that you can use it pretty much anytime, anywhere. For example, while I personally prefer putting pen to paper and physically writing my letters in my journal, there are times when that's just not convenient. And in those situations, I have absolutely used the Notes app on my phone or even just sent myself a text. So, how do these letters work? While there's no one size fits all way to write yourself out of your stuckness, there are a few key things that I have found helpful. Number one, you can't challenge your stories if you don't know what your stories are. So, the first step of the process is figuring out the stories that are keeping you stuck. Pay attention to your internal dialogue. What are some of the less helpful things that your brain is telling you on the regular? And how are those things keeping you stuck? Make a list, write it down. Then, when those stories come up, build your letter around challenging that story. Number two, the voice in which you write these letters is very important. If you write your letters in the same self critical tone that your brain is delivering these unhelpful stories, you're not going to be able to rewrite them and get unstuck in the process. You need to tap into a more compassionate, loving, even celebratory voice, which I know can be hard, especially when you're stuck. I know when I was stuck, self compassion and self love were hard to come by, and I definitely was not celebrating myself on a regular basis. But there is a way to get around that. And that is tapping into someone else's voice that has no problem being compassionate and loving and celebratory towards you. As you're writing, imagine yourself as the person that loves you the most. Maybe it's a partner or a best friend or a sister or someone that really sees you and appreciates you and knows your worth. Then try to write the letter from that person's perspective. Or if that feels too difficult, flip the script. Imagine you are writing a letter to the person that you love the most. What would you say to them if they were having the same thoughts that you were? Tap into the love and compassion you feel for them and use that to infuse your letter to yourself with that same level of love and compassion. And finally, number three, consistency is key. Writing one letter is likely not going to rewrite any stories you're telling yourself. But one letter a day, now that is a different story. The more you write to yourself, the more you're reinforcing the self compassion. And the more you reinforce it, the more it will grow. So write to yourself often and keep writing until those stories start to shift and you start to feel less stuck. And the last stuck strategy that we talked about today is prioritizing new things and experiences. Now, this one can feel tough and can be a really hard place to start. But if you're able to get to a point in your stuck journey where you feel ready and willing to put yourself out there and prioritize novelty and newness in your life, it can be really impactful. What that newness looks like is totally up to you. I went with dance and podcasting, but yours might be roller skating or learning to be a better baker or going on a walk every morning before you have a coffee or starting to say no when you don't really want to do something or a combination of all of those things. Just make a commitment to yourself to try, let's say, one new thing a week. Or if that feels like too much, just try one new thing a month and keep trying new things until you land on the things that make you feel alive and excited and motivated and unstuck. Now, again, I know that trying new things will mean something different for everyone, and there's no reason that your newness should resemble my newness. But I will say that the dreaming part feels pretty universally helpful. When you're stuck, it can be hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And giving yourself time and permission and space to allow yourself to dream about who you want to be and what kind of life you want to have and what you want to build and grow and try and foster can be transformative. So give yourself that time and permission and space. Maybe that means making a vision board or journaling for 15 minutes in the morning or spending time in meditation and visualizing what it would be like to be unstuck and what it will take to get there. There's no right or wrong way to do it. Just dream. Chances are it may feel a little foreign and kind of antithetical to the stuckness that you're feeling, but that's kind of the point. Well, that is my story of my most recent season of Stuck and some of the tools that I used to get myself unstuck. These are not the only stuck strategies that I use to get unstuck, but these are the tools that I found to be especially helpful as I navigated my stuckness. And I hope that they were helpful for you too. I would love to highlight more tools for getting unstuck for future episodes. And while I certainly have more to share, I'd love to hear about the tools and strategies you've used to get through your own seasons of stuck. So, if you have any tools that you found particularly helpful in making the journey from stuck to unstuck, I'd love to hear them. Send us an email at seasonofstuck@gmail.com with your favorite stuck strategies, and I will shout out those strategies in a future episode. The more tools we can assemble, the better equipped we will be for if and when we find ourselves experiencing stuckness in the future. So I would love to hear about what's worked best for you. That's it for today. A huge thank you to you, our listeners. We know that there are so many podcasts out there to choose from, and we are just so grateful that you chose ours. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider recommending the podcast to a friend or family member that you think would enjoy it. And to make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. And while you're there, if you loved the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review. It plays such a huge part in getting this podcast out to a wider audience and ultimately supporting more people on their journey from stuck to unstuck. And to keep in touch and access even more stuck-related content, follow us on Instagram at Season of Stuck and visit our website, seasonofstuck.com, where you can sign up to get episodes delivered directly to your inbox. Thank you again for being here. It is so, so appreciated. Until next time, I'm Deanna deBara, and you're listening to Season of Stuck.